Hi, my name is Vishnu Krishnan. I am a graduate student in the Masters of Information Systems program at DePaul University, based out of Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. The topic of my presentation today is process identification, which is the subject of Chapter 2 of the Fundamentals of Business Process Management. This is the high-level agenda of today's presentation. We'll start off by describing what is process identification and what is it comprised of. As we'll see later on in this presentation, process identification is comprised of process architecture definition as well as process selection. Both of these elements will be described later in this presentation in further detail. We'll go through the balanced scorecard approach as well as enterprise architecture. We'll then get into the process architecture definition. We'll go through the different process categories as well as the relationships between processes. Following this, we'll delve further into reference models as well as process landscape models. We'll then go through the second component of process identification, which is process selection, and delve further into selection criteria. Finally, we'll wrap up the presentation by going through measures of process performance as well as process portfolio. Now, what is process identification? Process identification involves the execution of tasks with the primary goal of establishing the required business processes of an organization. Process identification is the basis for an organization to narrow down which business processes can be further improved and made more efficient. The primary business processes which should be targeted are those that not only provide the best return on value or investment, but also those business processes which are inefficient and require considerable improvement. An important point to consider throughout this presentation is that process identification is a macro process. It focuses on a full set of integrated processes in an organization and not just on a single isolated process in a silo. As we went through earlier, process identification is composed of the definition of process architecture, which outlines the business processes and integration between different business processes, as well as process selection, which outlines the guideline for determining which processes take precedence over others. The goal of process selection is to categorize an organization's processes according to relative priority as well as importance. Some processes should be prioritized over others due to their strategic importance. The balanced scorecard approach is a method that organizations can use to determine business goals. Through the balanced scorecard approach, business processes can be further categorized according to importance, as well as how they relate and contribute to the execution of an organization's overall business strategy. The balanced scorecard is comprised of four distinct components. The first is the financial perspective, which primarily involves improving cost allocation, increasing the utilization of assets, and improving value provided to end customers. The second being customer perspective. Customer perspective focuses on a product or service's attributes such as the price, quality, availability, and how the image of the brand is viewed by your end customers. The next is internal perspective. Internal perspective focuses on processes such as operations, customer services, regulatory compliance and quality control, as well as innovation. And the final component of balanced scorecard is the learning and growth perspective, which focuses on setting up a thorough and complete process, and is also influenced by human capital, which is essentially the value of a worker's skills, information capital, the value of information and data, and finally, organizational capital. While the balanced scorecard approach primarily focuses on the business goals of an organization, as well as their interrelations, enterprise architecture outlines the reliance and dependencies between the various viewpoints of an organization. Now, there are various frameworks that can be used to further elucidate on enterprise architecture. The first being TOGAF, or the Open Group Architecture Framework, and the next being Zachman Framework. Through enterprise architecture, the structural integration and dependencies between various business processes can be further understood. Enterprise architecture framework can be used, for example, to determine which processes might be directly related to the downtime of an enterprise application, as well as which technical support or IT activities are affected by the downtime of this enterprise application as well. We'll now delve into the first component of process identification, which is process architecture. The focus of process architecture is to outline and visually represent the respective business processes executed by an organization. Process architecture involves differentiating categories of processes, expanding and expounding on the relationships between these processes that are vital to the process architecture, and finally establishing the process landscape, which is the highest level of the process architecture. According to Porter's value chain model, there are three categories of processes. The first being core processes. Core processes involve the manufacturing of goods and services, sales, as well as the sourcing and procurement of material. Core processes are also referred to as primary activities and essentially cover the processes that generate value for a company. The next category of processes are support processes. These involve the procurement of consumables, for example, hardware, stationery, furniture, IT management, as well as financial and legal services. Support processes are also called support activities, and essentially are processes that facilitate the execution of core processes. Finally, we have management processes, which involve risk management, compliance, supplier management, and budget allocation. Management processes provide compliance as well as regulations for executing both the core and support processes described prior. There are three types of relationships that exist between processes. The first is sequence, where the output of one process is used as an input in another process. This is also referred to as horizontal and sequential. An example of this would be procuring materials to produce products. The next relationship is decomposition, in which one process is broken down into one or more sub-processes, which are more comprehensive or more detailed. Decomposition is also referred to as a vertical or a hierarchical relationship. As we can see on the diagram on the right part of this slide, the process of procuring products is broken down into processing the parts and then assembling the parts. Finally, we have specialization, in which numerous variations and modifications exist for a broad or generic high-level process. As you can see on the diagram, the generic high-level process is handling of job application. The variants that exist are to handle the job application for Austria, as well as handling the job application in Germany. Reference models allow business process analysts to visually identify the various organizational processes, as well as understand their integrations and overall architecture. Industry standards for reference models include ITIL, or the Information Technology Infrastructure Library, and SCORE, or the Supply Chain Operations Reference Model. Reference models provide several advantages. Now, reference models can be used as a template to organize and classify business processes that should take priority over others. They can also be used to verify that an organization's business processes are complete and free of significant gaps or known issues. Finally, reference models can provide a consistent and industry standard technique or way to label and document business processes. A process landscape model is a depiction of an organization's process architecture, which primarily focuses on processes at the highest level, or level 1. Process landscape models portray vital processes at a very conceptual or abstract level. A common guideline is that process landscape models should be very easy to comprehend by individuals and stakeholders within all levels of the organization, and should be limited to showing a maximum of only 20 organizational processes. Drafting a process landscape model should include input from all crucial representatives of an organization, including senior leadership as well. There are 7 steps to construct a process landscape model. The first step is to clarify terminology. The major terminology in the process model should be defined as accurately as possible. There are cases where an organization keeps an in-house verbal glossary of all of the organizational terms, which can be leveraged for the purpose of this step. This allows all of the major stakeholders or representatives in an organization to understand the end-to-end business process. The second step in the construction of a process landscape model is to identify end-to-end processes. These are processes which are integrated with your end customers as well as the vendors. And through analysis of materials and services that are procured, the identification process can be initiated, kicked off. The various properties that can be used to identify end-to-end processes are product type, service type, channel, and customer type. The third step to construct a process landscape model is to identify the sequential processes for each end-to-end process. This involves identification of the consecutive outputs of the end-to-end process and how these outputs are fed as inputs in subsequent processes. The factors that can be used to identify these sequential processes include product lifecycle, which are the different states in the manufacturing of a product that segregates a process, customer relationship from lead generation to contracting and invoicing, supply chain, which involves the quality control of material procured and the follow-on delivery to customers, transaction stages, which involves initiation, negotiation, execution, and finally acceptance, change of business objects, so segregation of processes based on business objects, and finally separation, which is categorizing a process according to its temporal, spatial, or logical type of separation. The fourth step in construction of a process landscape model is to identify all of the management and support activities for each end-to-end process. This involves narrowing down what is required to facilitate the processes that were just identified, such as HR, materials management, financial accounting, information. The fifth step is to decompose and specialize business processes. This step involves breaking down the identified business processes into lower level business processes, or L2 processes, and if necessary, breaking those L2 processes even further into level 3 processes. Processes should be decomposed and broken down to the point where each process can be supervised and controlled by a single and sole process owner. The sixth step is to compile a process profile. This involves using a process profile to further expand on each process with the integration points, the key performance measures, as well as the required resources for execution of these processes. Finally, the seventh and last step to construct a process landscape model is to check for completeness and consistency. This involves the usage of reference models to cross-verify that all vital business processes have been documented as well as considered. The second component of process identification is process selection. The primary goal of process selection is to identify and confirm the indicators for evaluating the performance of an organization's business processes. Processes are categorized by their relative impact and importance, as well as maturity within an organization. The following selection criteria should be used to assess the business processes identified. The first selection criteria being strategic importance, which is used to evaluate the impact and relevance of each process in an organization. Assessing the overall return on value, distinctness, as well as performance advantages. The second selection criteria is health, which is used to assess the health of a respective business processes, as well as determine which process requires the most attention and oversight. The final selection criteria is feasibility, which is used to assess if the business processes are achievable and whether any barriers or hurdles exist preventing the process from being executed as efficiently and effectively as possible, and subsequently value from being generated by the business process. We'll finally wrap up this presentation by discussing the measures of process performance as well as the process portfolio. In order to gauge the overall health and production of a business process, the following criteria can be utilized to measure the performance of a business process. The first being time. When we refer to time, we primarily mean cycle time or throughput time, which essentially correlates to the duration of executing a single instance or sub-process. The next measure of process performance is cost. The primary objective is to lower overall costs. Costs are divided both into fixed costs, which are costs that are constant regardless of output, and variable costs. Variable costs vary based on the output produced. The next component is quality, which refers to both external and internal quality. External quality can be quantified and measured using customer approval and loyalty, while internal quality can be gauged based on how a user reacts to and their overall impressions of executing a business process, whether the business process is difficult to execute or whether it's very straightforward and easy to execute. The final component of process performance or measure of process performance is flexibility. Flexibility is a measure of how easily a business process can respond to and adapt to external variations in the environment. The final topic of this presentation focuses on the process portfolio. A process portfolio is a complete collection of an organization's business processes, which can be depicted visually. A process portfolio focuses on three factors of consideration, the first being importance, the second being health, and the third being feasibility. Each of these factors can be quantified and graphically depicted. In a process portfolio, higher priority business processes should be placed in the upper left quadrant, while processes that are respectively less vital to an organization can be placed in lower quadrants. This is depicted in the diagram at the bottom of the slide. An important point of consideration within the process portfolio is the number of processes chosen for the purpose of improvement and efficiency. Variables such as overall capacity, resource limitations such as financial resources, and intricacy or complexity of business processes should be taken into consideration, since these business processes are tightly integrated with each other. This concludes my presentation on process identification, the subject of the second chapter in the fundamentals of business process management. Thank you for taking time to listen to my presentation.